So welcome to all of you. My name is Sinead McBrearty and I'm the Chief Executive of Education Support. And as I'm sure all of you know, because everybody knows, Education Support is the mental health charity for everybody working in education. And we have a variety of free services that you can access. Colleagues will post about those as we go through the webinar. And I'm delighted to welcome our partners, Impact Ed, we're going to have Steph and Vicky both talking and explaining a bit about their work in a moment and kicking the conversation off. And then I'm also super pleased to have two of my favorite system leaders on this webinar. We've got Sufyan Sadiq and Kat Howard, both of whom are full of bags of wisdom. So I should just be stopping talking and letting them crack on as soon as possible. But we're going to have, I think, really quite an interesting conversation about the relationship between pupil and teacher wellbeing. And if that's not what you signed up for, well, stay in the room anyway, because it's going to be really good. But to start with, let me just briefly tell you a little bit, another couple of words about who's in the room. So Steph Hamilton is the Director of Engagement of the engagement platform at Impact Ed. She was a teacher, a science teacher. She also spent some time at the Brilliant Club, which is in fact brilliant, and now is working on staff engagement at Impact Ed. So delighted to have Steph here. We also have from Impact Ed, Vicky Fisher. Vicky was also a teacher of religious studies and philosophy and has worked at a MAT and worked at the Royal College of GPs and is just generally all over this whole data and engagement business. And will be talking to us about the findings of their work. Then in terms of my colleagues, also to introduce Kat Howard, who's the Executive Director of School Improvement at Core Education Trust. Kat's also led development at Teaching School Hub and reaching more than 200 schools through that work. She also has a habit of writing education bestsellers. So she's done this on workload and wellbeing as well as on curriculum. So you will be delighted to hear from her later, I know. And Sufyan Sadiq, who is Director of Teaching School at Chiltern Learning Trust. They are one of the largest CPD providers in the country, and Sufyan is also an activist within the sector on equity, inclusion, race, and much more besides. He's got a lot of different perspectives to bring to the table, and I'm delighted that he's joining us on this session as well. So that's enough introduction, I think. Steph and Vicky, I'm going to hand over to you to do a brief bit of scene setting for a few minutes, and then we will get stuck into the conversation. So There you go.
Thanks so much, Sinead, and big welcome to everybody joining. And really glad that lots of people are caring about this sort of, I guess, big question of students and staff and thinking about wider school culture. So as Sinead said, we from the Impact Ed group. Vicky is going to be kind of talking through some of the data that we've collected through Impact Ed evaluation, and I'm going to be chatting through some of the more staff focused and school employee data that we've been collecting through the engagement platform, or TEP. And I think we are very much here to set the data scene, and then I'm going to be really interested to hear those school insights and kind of, I guess, those more practical on the ground viewpoints as well. But what we are initially seeing is that these things are really tightly tied together. So Vicky and I are going to take you through some very quick data points to just kind of show you what sort of data we've been collecting and what story that tells us to kick us off. Vicky, do you want to click onto the next one and take us through the Working Well report?
Great, yes, thanks, Steph. So my name's Vicky. I'm the School Partnership Officer at Impact Ed Evaluation. So I work with schools and multi-academy trusts across the country, helping them to evaluate the impact of their work. As part of this, we collect loads and loads of data on things like pupil wellbeing. And so in autumn 2022, we launched a report called Working Well, which was using all of this rich data that we gathered from pupils and putting that alongside some data we gathered from staff to look at the relationship between staff wellbeing and pupil wellbeing. So just for a bit of context, on the pupil side, we had nearly 80,000 wellbeing assessments and nearly 40,000 assessments around anxiety, and we produced a report called Working Well. I'll pop a link to it in the chat a little bit later. And these were kind of some of the key findings. The staff survey was relatively small scale, but I think the findings were really interesting. And Steph will talk in a minute about how we can draw that data out a little bit further and some of the extra things we've collected since then. So I've put on the screen, hopefully you can see that okay, 2 charts which show a correlation analysis. If you're not familiar with these, basically this looks at 2 numbers and 2 sets of data and how they relate to one another. So if you score a 1, it means that the 2 numbers go up at the same rate. So if one was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and the next one was 2, 4, 6, 8, and they were going up at the same rate, you'd have perfect correlation, and 0 means there's no correlation, and then a minus figure would mean as one goes up, the other goes down. Right in the corner, you can see a little visualization of what this looks like. So apologies, that's quite a quick overview of correlation analysis, but you can have a look at the report and read it in a bit more depth if you're interested. But if we look at the graph on the left-hand side, we can see this was the work we did on the staff surveys, and you can see that the main thing where there was a correlation between staff satisfaction and some of the other drivers we looked at was staff feeling that they were supported as an individual at the school, which is perhaps something that we would expect. You will also see that the greeny blue color, these all represent leadership drivers. So these were when we asked questions like, do you feel like the leadership team is taking you taking the school in the right direction? Do you feel supported by the leaders at that school? And we can see, again, perhaps not surprisingly, where staff felt like they had a supportive leadership team, they were much more likely to be satisfied. So we're seeing very high correlation numbers there. Then what we did is we looked at that in relation to pupil wellbeing. So here you can see at the top, the key things that came out were around behaviour, which is perhaps what we might expect. So where teachers said that there was good behaviour in the school, pupils tended to have better wellbeing. The really interesting part of that is that the very top, so the driver from the teachers that correlated most strongly with the pupil wellbeing. So where teachers answered a question positively, pupils were more likely to have high wellbeing, was around this idea of effective systems in school for behaviour management. And again, you can see the lines in blue are all around leadership. So where staff felt that they had good leadership, pupils were more likely to have high wellbeing. As I said, this was a relatively small scale study, but it was sort of the launching point for some of the work that Steph's going to talk us through in a little bit more detail.
Great, thanks, Vicky. If you want to jump on to the next slide. So some of these questions that we asked in the Working Well report were from the engagement platforms standardized question set that we use, and we have been continuing to ask these questions to over 100 schools over the last 18 months and have got over 7,000 teacher responses that we have looked at. And what we can see from that initial report that we did back in autumn 2022, last year, is these same themes are continuing, and we'll kind of continue to look at how does this then correlate back into pupil wellbeing. But just to look at the staff engagement and wellbeing side, this graph here, in a similar way to Vicky's graphs showing correlation, we're looking at how much engagement drivers listed here correlated to overall headline engagement. So how connected do people feel and how likely are they to recommend the school that they currently work in? So what we can see here is leadership and management are consistently the most kind of highly correlated with headline engagement, alongside growth, development, retention, teacher wellbeing, and diversity and inclusion. So what we can see here is that leadership quality are kind of consistent drivers of engagement and wellbeing, and we're continuing to see these repeated patterns all the way through the collection that we've had. We are also kind of looking at teacher wellbeing alongside a big range of factors, so that leaders have some really good data to know where they might need to take some action, which will then in kind of impact and improve teacher wellbeing overall. And we are going to be continuing to collect this all the way through this academic year. So if you are interested in kind of finding this out for your school or encouraging your leadership team to get involved with this, do get in touch. And what we are kind of continually finding, which is going to be kind of interesting to get the school takes on this, is the positive school culture and environment building is everything. So if you've got your positive school culture, it's highly likely that you are going to have high levels of staff and pupil wellbeing, which is a consistent theme we're seeing across these studies. So I'm gonna hand back. There's lots more to dive into, but I think we'll hand over to, Sinead, I'm gonna hand back to you.
Great, thanks, Steph. And I'm just going to take a clarification there from the audience, and then after that we'll stop sharing screen. But just the clarification is, can you explain what the headline engagement means in this context? I think you've got your one at the top, but I'll let you explain that.
Yeah, definitely. So we look at kind of how overall engaged a member of staff is to their school. So engagement is just a measure of how likely they are to recommend it to other teachers to work in, how likely they are to recommend it to their friends' children, how highly they rate the educational quality of the school, and overall how satisfied are they. So there's sort of, over those kind of key factors, we have a headline engagement score that we measure, and this is something that the schools taking part can track over time, and the engagement drivers that sit underneath that are all things that the research tells us are highly likely to affect overall engagement. And if we see high engagement, the research also tells us we're more likely to retain those members of staff, but we're also likely to have good pupil outcomes as a kind of an effect later on as well. So happy teachers, happy kids is the kind of main message.
That's the lovely kind of pithy summary stuff that we like. Happy teachers, happy pupils. So I'm going to just a couple of things. One is to ask Steph, are you happy for us to share these slides after, or the links that you've got, pick them up anyway? Yes.
Yeah.
Super duper. So that answers that question. There will be a recording available afterwards. And I want to encourage colleagues to, we're going to get into this conversation now, but if there are particular things that you want to know when you're sitting there listening to the conversation, please post a question. We will pick those up and deal with them. And then I'll also pay a special welcome, as I was looking at who's in the room, to colleagues from Northern Ireland. Delighted to see you here. And a warm British welcome to those who are dialing in from Vietnam and California. You're very welcome as well. Right, now that we've done that bit of housekeeping, Kat, I'm going to come to you first, and then Sufyan. Having looked, so there's loads of different threads of this that we could pick up, and the amount of time, 45 minutes left, seems ever so small now that we've seen it. But Kat, what strikes you here as the place you want to start?
I just find it massively reassuring that we're talking about staff wellbeing and the impact that will have in the correlation between staff wellbeing and pupil experience and outcomes and wellbeing and their overall experience in schools. Because I think historically there can sometimes be a real kind of false dichotomy between, we have to make a choice between teacher well-being or student well-being. And if it's in the good of students, then we have to almost sacrifice teacher workload and well-being in the process. So this is such a vital piece of research and data to share with the sector, so that we can start having conversations where we're not operating to, where one is at the detriment to another, which I think is so important. I also think that it enables us to start thinking about what this looks like in tangible form. I think sometimes when we talk about well-being, it can feel like this nebulous kind of immeasurable activity that school leaders are really keen to work out how to support their staff, but don't necessarily know what that looks like. And so I think you've given us some really tangible aspects where leaders can think quite carefully about how they create the conditions for teachers to, kind of build relationships with pupils in a really meaningful way that then informs their kind of teaching and day-to-day kind of, just being in the building and having a really positive experience and feeling motivated to coming into work every day, which I honestly, teachers that's exactly what they want to do, is think about teaching, talk with other teachers about teaching, or teach itself. And so I think it really does bring us back to this kind of core purpose of what it means to just feel really purposeful and motivated and fired up to coming into work every day. So I just a huge thank you, because I think that provides a real reassurance to the sector in terms of we don't need to think about pupil well-being and kind of set aside one or the other. And it also speaks a great deal in terms of that kind of what tangible practice looks like. So for me, I think to draw out the key findings around communication, what we already know that school leaders can do really effectively in terms of feedback loops, being open to kind of practice and what teachers need in terms of support, in terms of developing systems and processes in schools. It enables us to make workload reduction and teacher wellbeing a really tangible process and a strategy that can actually be very pragmatic and very practical. So it very much speaks to my perspective and my experience in terms of what we can do to improve teacher wellbeing at a local level, for sure.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kat. Steph, I'm going to go to Sufyan next, but I will come back to you because I was very struck by how relatively low workload sat on that correlation. So it'd be interesting to just unpack that a bit. I'll ask you to speak to that. But Sufyan, tell me, I saw growth development, it's up at the top of the chart. What were you drawn to in this? What struck you most?
I think the workload thing did strike me, because it kind of reminds me of what we've known in industry for a long time around Abraham Maslow's kind of hierarchy of needs. And you have this concept of actually sometimes when you're teaching, I'm a business teacher in background, and you're teaching motivation to young children in GCSE or A-level classes, you often talk about the fact that that pat on the back carries greater weight than a £50 bonus. When you try saying that to an A-level class, they'll say, no way, I'll take the £50 over the pat on the back from my leader. And I think what we're seeing here is actually we're willing to bear and adjust a lot of pain through the job if the human factors of the job are things that we get right. Our human interactions actually, like the leadership, and why leadership is so pivotal. The human to human interactions are the ones that are probably the most impactful in as a detriment to what they can do to us in our well-being within the workplace. And that often is underplayed. And for me, it kind of rings to a discussion I was having with a colleague today around teacher development, that you're a great teacher and a brilliant teacher in the classroom, and you've done a PGCE, you've done brilliant teaching in the classroom, then you become course leader. And if you're really good at managing a course, so schemes of learning and assessment and organizing your knowledge, you become a head of department and you'll go up. What we don't tend to do is develop people to lead people, to develop humans and lead humans. And what we really end up damaging in that process is we become managers, but we're not leaders, and we're unable to inspire, take people with us. And I spoke about something the other day, and what we need at the moment is extreme empathy. We're really lacking empathy. And I think a lot of those undertones came out to me looking at that evidence base.
Thanks, Sufyan. You'll have been pleased that we published the Teacher Wellbeing Index 23 last week, it feels like a year ago. And in the recommendations, we called explicitly for soft skills teaching for leaders, that we need much more, we need a significant investment in that across the sector. So couldn't agree more with you on that. Steph, to unpack the workload point and how it's showing up here for us a bit, please.
Yeah, definitely. So it's so interesting because there are huge sector pressures on workload, and obviously the pressure on schools to cover a huge amount of bases has gone up massively as funding has reduced in other areas. And I think A lot of the conversation around workload often does, like Sufyan was saying, is underplays that value of leadership and actually the role that leadership plays in softening the blow of those workload pressures. And I think this is what we're seeing in the data. So I think, you know, one of the really interesting things that came out of all of the pilot data was the particular value within the leadership category of the importance of the team being bought into the leadership strategy. So that question was really highly correlated with overall engagement, but also higher retention intentions. And what we can see is if you have a leadership team who has got their staff bought in, who people have communicated really well to them and are managing them really well, and as you were saying, have got that human touch, you can work around those workload pressures in a different way. And I often think this back to when I was teaching and the things that made the biggest difference to me. Workload is never ending as a teacher. There's never, especially when you're in a sector where there is no end of things that you can be doing for young people, that workload is always going to be high. But the biggest thing that affected my well-being was how a leader supported me or a manager interacted with me on a particular day, and either made me feel really well supported and was able to have struggles where you were going to inevitably have struggles, or where you felt belittled or undermined, or where there wasn't that support in place. And I think that's what we're seeing play out in the data. I think people come into the profession knowing that it is, you know, that there will be a lot of pressure and a lot of things for them to do. But teachers love to teach. They want to do the best for the kids in front of them. They will work around different workloads. And I think it is, you know, what I think I want to see from how leaders use this data going forwards. Sorry, this light keeps going off. Is how leaders can use the data we're generating in TEP to be maybe more experimental with how they're working around workload. Where can we see these schools that are beating the benchmarks for workload? Where can we find that best practice? Where are people being creative with flexible working and creating really interesting environments for people to work in that do help that overall engagement? And I think it'll be really interesting to see how that might affect some of their workload scores nationally overall.
Thanks, Steph. Kat, in the Teacher Wellbeing Index we published last week, there's a truly horrible number, which is 55% of education staff, and that's across all roles, we're not just talking about teachers, and includes leaders, describe their workplace as having a negative impact on their personal well-being. It's just a still shudder at this, and it feels very pertinent in this conversation because we're talking about leadership and culture. And I'm curious to hear from both you and Sufyan about, when we get into it with culture, what does good look like? How do we know? Because, you know, people can be very good at talking about an organization, a school in the abstract of, oh, we're terribly good here, we do this, that, and the other. But how do we really know? What are the good examples of really good practice that you've seen and appreciate? And if you were going in, you'd be looking to see what was happening around.
And I think you kind of raise the alarm bells there when you have a school leader who says, like, culture's really good here, because when you can be that really definitive about something that is so fluid and is impacted by so many different stakeholders, it's quite a difficult place to like draw like a point of assertion. And so I'm really keen to hear from those school leaders who say, you know, these are our values, this is what we stand for, but I'm constantly taking the temperature from my staff at every single layer of the organisation to ensure that their perception and their experiences are the same. So for example, is it that my early career teacher feels that their workload is impacted by the school calendar in the same way as my middle leader, as the same way as my more experienced teacher, as the same way as my senior leader? So where are we starting to build up really rich, intelligent data and feedback? Those feedback loops are so critical so that actually we can stand by our convictions when we're saying culture is really strong here. This is just what we do. These are our social norms. This is what it feels like to work here. I think where you've got really strong practice, it's where those kind of a school or organisation has a vision and values, but that they can articulate to you how those values are mobilised. So, for example, a core is a really good example. When I came to work for the organisation, had a really immediate understanding of the collaboration, opportunity, respect and excellence as the values. But then we've already started having conversations as strategic leaders around, okay, well, what do they look like as a leader, as a system leader? How do I mobilize those values? What does my behavior need to look like? And how do my actions translate that into practice? So where am I recognizing opportunities for my colleagues where they may not necessarily see themselves in those opportunities? Where am I demonstrating mutual respect and kind of asking what people's workload looks like before I'm kind of throwing a heap of kind of tasks their way? And where are we co-constructing in terms of developing models of excellence? Where am I considering readiness as a key component? For example, if we're looking at curriculum development or significant changes around implementation, where are we mapping into the timeline, the training and development that needs to take place in order to take those colleagues to a place where they feel really confident and ready for change? So I think it's really thinking about, as an organisation, where have you got kind of the feedback loops or the communication loops, I suppose, for staff to be able to challenge and say, actually, I don't think this is in line with our values. I don't think we're mobilising our values here. But also, where are you considering how your policy and practice is mobilizing your values so that you can everybody draws back to the same kind of, this is what we do here. So I think when we're talking about culture, we need to have the kind of the realism, I suppose, that will change, and it needs almost kind of, it needs constant care and attention to be able to make really confident claims around the culture of your organization, I think.
That point that culture is dynamic is so important, isn't it? Because we can put a huge amount of effort into building a culture, and we can then have a period of excess demand, let's call it that, but more than usual requirement. And it can really squeeze people and make people feel like, hang on, I thought I was respected here, or I thought we had this kind of culture, but actually now I'm being asked to do this. And I think it's very difficult actually to find the ways of holding those norms through periods of intense pressure. But having a perspective on culture that sees it as dynamic is really helpful, because I think just knowing it's less binary, it's less a case of people, this is a good place or a bad place. Actually, there's a much bigger gray area, which I think as leaders is really important to hold. Sufjan, what are you thinking about when you're looking at, when you're thinking about culture and leadership? What is it that you really want to see and you think really makes a difference in schools?
I think live it, don't laminate it. I think that for us is a big thing. There's no school in the country that says, as you arrive into the reception, and my job is going into hundreds of schools, I've never seen a school that says, we are committed to treating people really badly in this place. And there's a hell of a lot of schools that treat people really badly. But everyone says it's about being ready, respectful, kind, caring. Everyone has got the values. The problem is we're obsessed in education with laminating these values, putting them on the wall, plastering them on the wall. What we don't do is we don't give time to think about these things. Maths are a prime example. Maths are now mini authorities creating subcultures within the educational landscape. And loads of them have just copied and pasted their visions and values from somebody else's math handbook and another person's math handbook, and they all look almost identical. So what you don't have is unique DNA in organizations that have a way of working. This is what we do around here. This is the culture in our organization. So people throw that phrase, culture, eat strategy for breakfast. Well, the only thing I understand from that phrase is culture clearly is something that needs to be fed. Forget the strategy element. What are you doing to feed the culture in your organization? What are you doing to think about developing a culture? Are you codifying it? So we're codifying curriculums and we're codifying other things. within the school, but are we codifying the ways of behaving, the ways of talking, the ways we treat people, the way we speak to people in line management? Are we codifying the way of doing things around here? And that creating that culture requires a really strong leadership from the very top, modeling it, walking it, talking it, living it, and not laminating it at the very top of the organization. But then we're almost losing an element of a lack of pure humility that's not there. When we get it wrong, we've got to say we've got it wrong. Nobody gets it wrong anymore. Nobody makes a mistake. And if they do, you get a non-disclosure agreement and you're gone before we can even accept that we've made a mistake. So we've got to get to a position where, as organizations, we're able to say, we make a mistake, we've made a mistake, we've got it wrong, and we're going to do it better next time. We listen to people on surveys, and surveys results come in, and Steph and these guys provide amazing data from these surveys. We get alarmed and we think, right, what's our spin on this? What are we going to tell them about the great things? Why are we spinning stuff? Like, people are talking. It's great. They're giving feedback. That's great. Let's learn from it. And I think culture is totally misunderstood. And we've ended up with a borrowed culture from a neighboring organization that we stole it from. We then bastardized it within our own organizations, and it no longer has any real meaning or form within our organization. And therefore, you've got nothing to hang your hat on as an organization. It's meaningless. Therefore, the way you treat people, it doesn't matter, because person A, person B, and C treat them differently, because there's no codified, coherent way of dealing with people in your organization, because nobody's actually spoken about it or invested in it or fed that element in the organization, because we're concerned with the urgent operations of the day and not the important things that make organizations. And that's, for me, is the most important thing. Culture is the important part. It might not be your firefighting on a day-to-day basis, but if you don't do that important part every day, that urgent's going to have lots of collateral damage every day.
It's really interesting, the comments about borrowing and bastardizing visions and missions and values. I'm very struck by the increase in a sort of corporate style process and documents, really documentation. It's more what's written down, isn't it, than what's lived, that seeks to mimic what we see in the commercial sector. And I think it comes from an idea that somehow what happens in the private sector is better than what has happened in the public sector, which I've spent my career disagreeing with politely. And I think we don't have the confidence actually in the public sector often to take a stand and really be who we are. But when you, I love what you were saying there about feeding the culture. It never ceases to amaze me how really basic sometimes that is. And, you know, if we could just get people to be respectful and kind and empathic in their interactions, which doesn't seem bonkersly difficult, that would go such a long way. The number of conversations we hear between people that are really aggressive or confrontational or challenging in an unhelpful, unconstructive way. And of course, this all makes up part of the culture. So I think there's a bit where we can sometimes feel that culture is we can talk ourselves into thinking culture is some big mushroom up there. But the idea of feeding it and owning it and making it normal in everyday life, I think is really, really key and critical. I feel like there's an awful lot more that we could say about culture. But I want to ask one, and colleagues, I can see there's loads of chat, which I'm not able to keep up with because my eyes just frankly aren't good enough unless I put my glasses on enough. But if you have a specific question you want to put to the panel, please use the Q&A tab for that. But what, Kat, Sofian, Steph, Vicky, what do we do if we're in situations? I'm thinking a lot of the people on this call are working in schools. They don't necessarily have senior leadership responsibility. If we're working in cultures that are not pleasant, let's just use that term, what can ordinary school staff do to make a difference around that? Yeah.
I would say we're in a supply and demand crisis for teacher recruitment and retention. The supply is not meeting the needs of the demand. The reason that's really important is that organizations are no longer in the luxurious positions they've been in historically. Therefore, teachers, the power teachers now possess is significantly more in vast spades of the country, where actually, if your teacher walks out, replacing that teacher becomes incredibly difficult. Therefore, organizations need to realize that to retain good staff, that they've got to change. When you're in a toxic culture, and people have been in toxic cultures, either they've worked themselves or some of us have had a partner or friend or somebody that's worked in a toxic culture, it spills out into that person's life. This idea that you can put things in boxes and you drive home and work is at work. That we're humans. We don't work and operate that way. When we're hurt, the hurt doesn't finish at 4 o'clock. We carry on hurting in the evening. And when we're stressed, we carry on thinking in the evening, and we can't sleep properly. The spillover effects of toxic working environments are that actually people, and it's difficult, and I accept the fact that it is difficult to say people should raise their concerns, because sometimes the problem in toxic cultures is you raise your concerns, they don't listen to you. You get shut down and you'll get bullied and all sorts of things happen. But where you can leave, organizations that cannot look after people will come unstuck in this current climate very quickly, because if you can't retain people, you haven't got the luxury of lots of money to throw money at recruiting people, and there's not enough teachers. And the schools that treat people well will end up with teachers staying and more teachers coming and wanting to work there. And the ones that don't, and that's where that leadership team gets exposed and realizes we either change or we're doomed. And I know it sounds very apocalyptic in my worldview in doing that, but I think voting with your feet is the only way you can make a difference in a lot of situations.
Yeah, I think that whole question of leaving is really important. I think when we see people leaving education as a profession, so there's times when we'd like to jump in front of them and say, you're actually leaving this school. You don't necessarily want to leave teaching. So I think moving employer is a really important bit. Kat, do you have something to add into this?
I also think that there's something in this in terms of just coming back full circle when we were talking about empathy before and being an empathetic organisation or an empathetic sector. What we are also seeing is that due to the supply and demand issue that Sufyan's just talked about, that we have, like I used to work in finance before, I used to work in the private sector, you had a really robust induction to any role that you took on. So you were trained before you sat in the role. We do things very back to front in education. People find themselves in roles and then we're training and developing them to be, you know, really highly expertise in that role, but normally they're in the role first. And we're seeing more and more of that now in the current position landscape that we're in. I really feel for our middle leaders and our senior leaders in terms of being in positions and then not necessarily having the extensive working models of how to deal with kind of HR related policy and the human aspect that we're talking about a great deal. You can only see it if you've experienced it. And if you've worked in or kind of trained in a toxic organization, you found yourself in a leadership position where you're managing others, it's really difficult to be what you haven't seen. So what we don't want is to become a sector that's eating itself almost, where, you know, we've got kind of toxicity that feeds on toxicity because they're the only working models out there. So I think this is where teacher development is so important for wellbeing and workload over the longer term, because what we're actually doing is developing really strong working models of how to support and how to lead effectively and how to do some of these things that we've been talking about around making culture really tangible. So for teachers, I think, that are in that position, and you know, I've been in that position previously where I've had to act with integrity and follow the kind of policy and practice, and realize that I'm only going to get so far, and left and found a stronger organization. But I think for those teachers looking for, when you're looking, I call it scoping out your school, when you're looking for that opportunity and where you want to take yourself next, look for the organizations who are really clear in their convictions with kind of their vision and values, but also where they're really investing time in teacher development and moving other stuff out of the way. So where teacher development and professional development for staff is central to that organization, that's where they've thought about not just necessarily the kind of accountability aspect and holding people to account, but also the wraparound care in terms of, okay, we're not quite getting this right, but what's next? What does that look like? How am I going to support you so that we can get it right, so that it does look better next time? And I think there's such a duty of care there, particularly for less experienced leaders, for us to ensure that we don't end up in that position where toxicity is becoming toxicity and so on and so forth, and it's inherited over time. I think for me, I think, you know, looking at the schools where they value stuff in a range of ways, but particularly around how they develop people and support them in the roles that they find themselves in is really critical here.
I think there's that bit that you're speaking to, which is turning it, what's a vicious circle of negativity into maybe a virtuous circle of improvement. And development is so key to that, not least because we know from the evidence and the literature that for educators to have access to high quality professional development increases their protective resilience. So it's not just that they're learning more and they're intellectually engaged, their whole well-being is fundamentally improved and lifted by this experience. So I think it's definitely one of the big levers to pull around these issues. Steph, were you wanting to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what Kat and Sufyan kind of were saying, especially around training. And I think the slightly less glamorous opinion that I guess lots of leaders have around kind of establishing good line management practice is definitely something that I have seen in a lot of schools. But I think the thing that I wanted to add in there was, if you are in that toxic culture and you know they're not listening to your personal feedback, some strategies that have been really interesting in some of the schools we've seen is really trying to speak to the problems they're trying to solve. So I think working around maybe that vision that you know maybe the leaders have, and you know that hesitancy to accept feedback. Some of the data that were coming out of this is going to help them reduce costs when they're trying to recruit people. So if you can work around that and give them data that's not about your specific issue, but you're kind of saying, look, gathering good feedback is going to really save you some money in terms of losing staff members. Really try and speak to some of the practical problems that you've got in there. If you are in the right mental space to do so, and I think I do echo those points, go and look, you know, if you are in an environment that is not positive, go and look for some schools that are kind of showing a lot more willing to be developing these cultures. And you know, one thing that you can do is ask for a summary of what staff feedback is in the school. So as well as us looking at the pupil outcomes data, that is, you know, the main flag that we're looking at in terms of what a quality of school is. If you're approaching other schools, go and ask them, you know, what's your staff engagement score? What is, you know, ask whatever survey and things that they're doing. Put pressure on the system as you're moving around it to show that you are trying to find the best place to work and that you value that. And you know, as TEP evolves, we're going to be giving schools some kind of little badges that they can use to display that this is something that they're caring about and that there's a feedback system in place. There will be other similar ones from other organisations as well, so you can put pressure on kind of schools recruiting in that way too, and just ask for that data that they may or may not have, and maybe they'll start gathering it if you ask them about it.
I think just also asking the question, what are we doing about our culture? What are we doing to look after the well-being of staff? How are governors looking at well-being? And asking those questions, I think just raising them actually can be more powerful than you might realize. I'm going to just come to Caroline's question, which is around, she's saying individuals still need to make a conscious, intentional effort. And how do we encourage buy-in? And I guess this is a whole point about what's the responsibility of the organization and what's the responsibility of the individual working in the school. Kat, Sufyan, I'm particularly interested to hear your thoughts on this. Kat.
I think in terms of where the responsibility or accountability lies, I think as an organisation, you certainly have a duty of care to ensure that. And it's not even like, aside from the fact that we are human beings attempting to look after other human beings, alongside that, it's just good business sense to look after people, you know. Retention, recruitment, it costs are through the roof. And when we were working in, you know, when I worked in the finance sector, we talked quite overtly at the fact that it would cost £12,000 to recruit and onboard and induct a member of staff. It you know, that was really prevalent across our regional area management. And so we always had that consideration in mind, alongside the human aspect and the kind of informing around policy and things like that. So it's just good business sense to know to look after people. And I think that does need to feed through your policies, the way that we do this. Some of the things that we've talked around are kind of, you know, practice and transparency around communication, and that can feed through a lot of the work that you do as strategic leadership. I think in terms of like what sits with the individual, I think it is about being really forthcoming in terms of feedback where things aren't quite hitting the mark. If I think about where we've had like higher kind of loss to the system, or those conversations that you have with teachers, it's been where sometimes school leaders aren't even aware of the reason. So for example, there's been a lapse in the process. For instance, there isn't even an exit interview process, or it's not being followed consistently. So you're not gathering that really rich data to help you to improve over time. And it will be where those teachers just haven't seen where they've got access to that communication loop to be able to have that conversation, and just share kind of, you know, what that's looked like. Or line management isn't necessarily consistent. And so that person hasn't got the opportunity to raise some of their concerns or say, actually, I'm really struggling. And therefore, it just falls by the wayside, where there's almost a sense of ceremony in having to go and find somebody to say, actually, I've got this problem and I need your help with it. So you tend to find that the systems and processes around communicating haven't been thought through. And we are a profession where we work in very isolated conditions. It's the whole, you know, single teacher in the classroom with the lights on and the rest of the building is dark. You know, that whole analogy isn't too far removed from the reality that we have to work really, really hard in building collaborative spaces and building opportunities for staff to communicate effectively, because then it's really low stakes to be able to air your concerns if you're having that regular touch point and say, and you're then in a position to challenge, as we said, where we're not adhering to our values, or perhaps where there's a pinch point that as a middle or a senior leader you didn't even realize existed for that individual, because it's not through your perspective. You haven't necessarily lived and breathed their timetable and their day to day, and haven't seen the kind of 3 or 4 competing priorities that have come from senior leadership. So those communication processes, you know, it's not just good practice, but it actually unravels a lot of the kind of the opportunities for staff to share how they're feeling and how things are landing. So it just makes good business sense. And I think so if that isn't, if you're not getting that opportunity to have a conversation on a regular basis with your line manager, that's a massive place to start, because that I feel that should be an entitlement for anybody operating in any sector to be able to have those conversations, so that they don't become high stakes, but they also don't become huge monumental problems where we're then losing staff from an organisation as a result as well.
There's a lot in there too that's around that point around aligning motivation for, we know that we have this deep sense of purpose in the education workforce, far higher than in most other industry sectors. And our job as leaders in lots of ways is to align their individual motivation with what we're trying to accomplish as a school. And there's a lot of noise around that. I get that can get in the way. But the more we can strip it back and make those links and help people. And sometimes I think I talk to leaders who are relatively inexperienced leaders, new leaders. And I think, you know, and I detect a lot of frustration around turnaround. If you're trying to change a culture, I think there is an expectation that my intentions are good. I'm going to tell you how it's going to be. I'm going to do a few things to prove that. And then bingo, surely we're up and running. And actually changing cultures and getting buy-in can take a good 2 years for trust to build. And then, as you helpfully point out, Kat, it's dynamic. It may not stick. You've got to attend to it. And as Sufyan says, feed it. Sufyan, this point about the responsibility of the organization and the responsibility of the individual. If we have teachers who are looking at the relationship between staff and pupil well-being and thinking, oh God, I've got to get this right for my students. And if I'm not managing this as well as everything else, I'm somehow letting them down. How do we help people who might be feeling that way? What would you say to them?
I think, again, the basic human thing, we've got to start talking to one another. We've got to start sharing when we have problems. One of the things that the pandemic threw us back a little is it eroded human interaction in our social lives, in our family lives. That erosion of human to human interaction, the ability to be able to say to someone, I'm feeling like this, I'm feeling like that. I always encourage teachers in our organization to be able to talk to someone and say to someone, I just want you to know how I feel. And I always tell other people, you can't comment or have an opinion on how someone feels. So we want to create spaces where people can say, I just want you to know how I feel, how I felt when you did X, how I felt when we had that one-to-one, when we had that meeting. So people being able to talk. When you're looking at the well-being of staff and the well-being of pupils, you can't pour from an empty cup. And we are empty vessels. A lot of us, because of the drain that the job has on so many teachers, to expect them to then be able to create an environment, an ecosystem in that class that's conducive to the well-being of young people and model to them what they should be doing, it's very hard, because when you're taking a beating yourself, it's very hard to suddenly get up, brush yourself off, and walk in and become this beacon of hope for everybody else, for the 30 people in front of you, when you don't see the glimmers of hope yourself. So I think reaching out to people for staff is really important. Reaching out to organizations like Education Support and other organizations. We have organizations outside of our immediate organization that are set up to be able to allow us to talk, allow us to be able to reach out for help. And I think traditionally, we always saw these external agencies as something that you go to when there's an absolute monumental crisis. The problem is, if you don't go early enough, you end up in the monumental crisis. And it's about early intervention. We talk about that in safeguarding and so many other forums within education. We talk about early intervention for yourself, identifying when things aren't going right, and you need to be able to speak, sharing with your organization how you feel. The development part, I always say, to lots of people, is the danger sometimes I find is sometimes people will say, I hate the way that I've been treated, and they get promoted and treat people exactly the same way because what's been modeled to them is just that. And you can be this ECT that's never really seen what good human leadership looks like. I give an example of a highly competent, highly capable, highly skilled and qualified leader that I was recently coaching. And we went through his school, and I also have an office based in that school. And it was just very simple interactions. 10 years you've been there, you've boomed straight through that school. Can I ask you a question? Tell me a bit about the receptionist. I know the name. No, tell me a bit more. I don't know. You don't know her son's name? No. You don't know what degree he's in? No. If you give her 1 minute, she'll tell anyone and everyone about it, because it's a massive moment of pride. And then let's go down, let's look at the caretaker, let's look at the cleaner. Now, we've not even got to your team. These are basic interactions. You've worked with these people for a decade, and you're not talking to them, and you're meant to be leading people. Right, let's look at someone in your team. Name me their 2 sons' name. I only know them in passing. They're not in my team. I don't know their names. That's a big deal. They're going through a marriage breakup in that family. How are you going to be this leader that can support this person, while this person somehow meant to divide and create this big border and come into work and forget about what's going on in their life. And you haven't taken the effort to learn the children's name so that you can have a meaningful, empathetic conversation with another human. And I think that element for us is really important. Us getting help, us making sure we start, if we're not in need of help, we start modeling what is extreme empathy in these times. What does it look like to be empathetic, and model it to those around us, especially those of us in senior positions, because we've got to remember people are looking at us. If we are the organization and we're not modeling it, how can we expect them to be delivering on that?
Well, and there's a lot more to be said on that, Sophie. And we at Education Support have been flagging the risks in the leadership group, which of course is when we look at the data around stress, burnout, exhaustion, loneliness, isolation. It's high across the whole workforce, but particularly so amongst leaders. And I think there's a bit about extending out beyond the school, and that humanity point actually is the same, isn't it? And finding those networks of support wherever we are in the system. And we could go on all day. We've barely scratched the surface, I think. I am going to just flag that my colleague's going to send a survey in the chat. If you would be kind enough to click and do whatever it is she asks you to do, that would be super. I'm going to ask colleagues for one sentence that you want people to take away. And I don't want brackets in the middle of the sentences, just to land that with you, which is my son's general trick. A colleague has posted a question we don't have time to get to around what you can do if nothing's changing and you're in a difficult situation. And I think I would just say a couple of things. One is, I'm really sorry that's the situation you're in. Please know that you can find an ear to talk that through with on our 08000 562 561 telephone number. So there will be somebody who'll be able to sit down and speak with you and maybe think through some strategies for approaching that. But I think what was said earlier, Sophia made the point that there are a limited number of things that you can do. And sometimes we need to leave an organization. If we really have tried and we're banging our heads against a brick wall, sometimes it's time to find another place to work. And that can be very painful for lots of reasons and not comfortable and easy for people. But I'm sorry we didn't have more time to take to pick up that last late question. Right, colleagues, one sentence. Steph, what have you got for me?
Pressure. That's I guess the one takeaway, that leaders need to be open to the feedback and be open to creating good feedback loops in the school. Otherwise, they're working without a map.
Fantastic. Thank you. Vicky, did you want to throw one in there, or are you delegating to Steph?
Yeah, no, I was just going to reflect on the piece around pupils, which is really school culture matters at every single level. So as we said at the beginning, it's not staff wellbeing versus pupil wellbeing. It's both.
Great stuff. Sufyan, you're on mute. Been a long day, man.
Yes. As leaders, we need to live it, not laminate it. And if we're going to be anything, we've got to be extremely empathetic.
Brilliant. And Kat?
Yeah, I think along the lines of don't think that your line manager knows how you feel. Like, be really forthcoming in having that conversation. I think conversations are absolutely critical. And as a school leader, this is a really long sentence. As a school leader, equally so, don't think because you've said it once that it's being lived and breathed out in the classrooms and the corridors. So just making sure conversation is key.
Love the use of the semicolon there, Kat. I just building on that, I would say also when you give that feedback, try and express it in terms of the impact the situation is having on you yourself, rather than maybe listing all the things that are wrong. If we stay with our own experience, that's always helpful, and it's your own experience. Nobody can take that away. Thank you all so much for joining this session. It looks like there is tremendous amount of chat. I'm sorry I couldn't keep up with it. But fantastic to hear from these very wise heads. So thank you to Sophie and Sadiq, to Kat Howard, to Steph Hamilton, and to Vicky Fisher. Thank you to all the education support staff for all the things that they did. Please fill out their survey. That will make them so happy. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time. If there are topics that you think we should be doing webinars on and having conversations about, let us know and we'll try and put that on. And in the meantime, have yourself a good Tuesday at 5 minutes. Thanks a million.